All right. Welcome, everybody, to episode 4 of the GMI Rocket Show, where we talk to immigration founders, entrepreneurs, executives about technology, marketing, growth, all the cool things happening in the immigration and global mobility space. Today, I'm really, really excited to have my friend and fellow immigration tech entrepreneur, Romish Badani, the CEO of Bridge Immigration. This is going to be a really, really awesome conversation. We're going to dive into Romish's background, kind of how he got into building Bridge, sort of what that process was like, and then where things are going to go in the future. Right now is a crazy time for immigration. So it's really, really interesting to hear people's thoughts on this topic. So Romish, thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate you putting in the time.
Yeah. Hey, Roman. Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, of course. I know. So you're out in the San Francisco area. I'm in New York City. How is it out there right now in general?
It's an odd time to be out here, right? I mean, all the value and all the perks of being in a city have sort of disappeared. So it feels like a bit of a ghost town, but we're hanging in there, all things considered.
Yeah. Same here in New York. It's kind of a ghost town when you go out into Manhattan. Really weird to see. I live out in Queens, which is sort of the outer borough, if you will. So it's generally pretty quiet out here, but now it's just way more quiet than ever before.
For sure.
So, you and I have known each other for a bit. We've talked a lot about immigration, about technology, about the industry, et cetera. I'm really excited because, with all these conversations I'm having, I get to learn about guests and I get to learn about other people and sort of how they got to where they are. It's not often you meet someone, even in a professional or kind of a, conference sort of context. And then you're like, hey, my name's Roman. So what was your experience in college and afterwards? And what were you like as a kid? You don't do all that kind of stuff. So I'm really enjoying these conversations, and I'm so looking forward to, learning a little bit more about you and sort of how you've gotten to where you are. So we'll obviously talk about Bridge. We'll talk about, where you are now, where you think, you're a very outspoken CEO. You share a lot of your ideas and thoughts on LinkedIn, on other social media platforms. Your team is really great about putting out really good information. So I'm really excited to talk about that. Before we get into it, though, I want to scale it back a little bit, right? And, I know my story, and I always say this. You and I chatted a bit before we started this. I always want to know how people started, right? That's always the hardest part. Like, how do you take your idea, especially within the immigration or global mobility context, and just turn it into, take those first steps to turn it into a product, turn it into a solution, turn it into some kind of a technology company. So why don't we start back a little bit? I mean, I know you went to business school. Before we even get there, did you always want to run a company? And I don't know, maybe give me a little bit of background about, like, did you envision being where you are today back when you were younger?
No chance. I mean, I think, I think like most of us, you look at our journey and it's a windy journey. It's non-linear in many ways. And I think that's reflective of my own journey. So, I was born and raised here in the United States, had a window into the immigration process and those challenges through my own family's background, but I directly never went through the process. So I was always sort of on the sidelines, had a secondhand perspective on it. Went to Berkeley for my undergrad. So I grew up in Southern California, moved up north to get my degree in business from Cal. And then after that, I really just fell into the track that many of us fell into around that time when finance was a very hot industry. And most business majors, sought to start a career in finance. And that's what I did. So I joined Goldman Sachs, was an investment banker in the healthcare group there for 2 years. I started in San Francisco and then left again, continued down that track. Amazingly, 6 months into that job, we were already being recruited for the private equity firms a year and a half down the road. And so before we even sort of knew what finance was about, we were already, being recruited for that next step. Jumped into that. I was a private equity investor at a firm called TPG Capital. And finally, after 2 years there, that's when I really stepped back and I said, look, is finance really my long-term path? I learned an incredible amount. I wouldn't trade that experience for anything at all. But ultimately realized that wasn't going to be my long-term career path. And So really went to business school for two reasons. One was to buy some time to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I viewed it as, look, my downside is I get an MBA from a great school. And my upside is I actually figure out what I really want to do and hopefully get to build something, which is in my heart what I felt like I wanted to do. And the other piece was I wanted to get out of the California bubble that I had grown up in, and I hadn't left California, right? And so for me, a big piece of this was expanding just personally my perspective on the world, going to business school, being surrounded by a student body that was 40% international students, right? That gave me some really great perspective and allowed me to interact with people that I probably would have never been able to interact with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was the same way as you. I studied financial economics in undergrad, and I actually interned in the financial industry all throughout. Like my first internship was as a freshman. I was 18 years old. I was working at Bear Stearns back, if you remember those guys.
Yeah.
And that actually was crazy because my third year, your junior year internship is like one of the more important ones. Mm-hmm. And I remember that's when it was 2008. And so Bear Stearns, was bought out by JP Morgan, and everyone was freaking out, and everyone was calling, my recruiter. I'm like, it's so late in the year. Am I going to get an internship? But I was similarly kind of in that industry where I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to study finance. I'm going to work in, whatever. I ended up realizing, thank God for internships, because I realized I really don't love this. And I quickly double majored. I stayed for an extra year in college and ended up going to law school. But the reality is I kind of went to law school to buy time, right? Yeah. Just like you did. And so, and that's why I'm so interested about kind of to hear the next step of your journey of how did you fall? Because you went right from business school into essentially launching Bridge, right?
So I had some intermediary steps, but yeah, that was my next step. So went to business school, knew that frankly, the classroom environment wasn't what I was there for. I mean, what was great about a career in finance and investing is it's basically an MBA on the job, right? You're learning about accounting, marketing, finance, different business models. I had gotten a lot of that exposure. So I wasn't going to get my MBA, and I had majored in business as an undergrad, right? So I sort of had that exposure. I went there to explore and to try things, right? And my first year, I was really interested in healthcare. I found I sort of serendipitously ran into a team of biomedical engineers at Johns Hopkins, basically connected through one of my classmates. And they had developed this really great medical device technology. But they were a team of biomedical engineers and had no idea how to bring this to market, right? And I was interested in building something, right? I just wanted to sink my teeth into something. I didn't have the technical chops to develop anything, but I wanted to try to commercialize something. And so I teamed up with those guys. And my first year, a big chunk of my first year was spent building this medical device company. Which was a fascinating experience. Eventually realized that I wasn't going to be the guy to take it through the FDA process, right? That's about where we were at. I had never done that before, but learned a ton about what it meant to build a business. We won a student venture competition. We got some funding, did a bunch of things at HBS that helped me learn a lot about business building. Mm-hmm. And then between my first and second year, went to a company called ZocDoc in the healthcare technology space based out in New York. And that was, I think, for me, that experience that allowed me coming out of that experience. And so ZocDoc is a consumer healthcare platform that helps patients connect to doctors and facilitates that process. And I think it was that moment when I realized that professional services broadly was broken in a lot of fundamental ways. And so coming out into my second year at HBS, that's when I really started thinking about analogs to that ZocDoc model. I started thinking about legal. I started thinking about accounting. I started thinking about real estate, all these professional service industries where the expertise is really, really important, but the experience for the consumer, for the end user, was fundamentally broken in my view. And so really wanted to try to leverage what I learned at ZocDoc to create a similar type of business. And that was really what led us to the V1 of Bridge, which wasn't exclusively an immigration tech company. It was really a marketplace to help connect consumers and businesses to attorneys across several verticals of which immigration was one of them.
So when it was a bridge, it was bridging people who needed legal support or help to those who can provide those legal services, but it was not focused on immigration law.
That's exactly right. We weren't even bridge at the time. We had a horrible name called LexSpot, LEXSPOT, like Lex for law. Awful name that nobody could say because the X and the S ran into each other.
Yeah.
That's where we started. We later switched over to bridge, but yeah, we were a marketplace. And that was, one of many iterations that ultimately got us to where we are today.
That's awesome. Did you have any immigration lawyers in your marketplace?
Yes. So what was interesting was we had 4 verticals. We had family law, immigration, bankruptcy, and estate planning, right? And what we saw was that immigration was the highest trafficked by far, right? And so we had built a bunch of these relationships with immigration attorneys who were on the other side of that marketplace, right? Mostly in the Boston area, we were building both sides of that market and starting to understand what individuals and what lawyers wanted from that experience. And there's a couple of things that stood out. One was the demand. One was the fact that immigration was one of the few practice areas that could be, that was priced as a flat fee, right? Everywhere else, we would go to family-based attorneys and we'd say, look, do you mind providing a quote for these common services so that when consumers are searching for you, they can filter by price or they can start to just get a better gauge of price. And they'd say, no, I can't provide that pricing. Same thing with bankruptcy, same thing with estate planning. Immigration attorneys were like, yeah, great. An H-1B is this and naturalization is that. Obviously subject to some variables that we need to verify. But between the demand and starting to learn a little bit more about that market in immigration led us to the next step.
That's so fascinating. And how did you go about sort of pivoting to immigration? Was it kind of a slow and steady pivot where you phased out other verticals and just stuck to immigration? Or did you just say, okay, that's it starting today, we're only doing immigration? You call bankruptcy lawyers, you're like, thanks, but we gotta part ways. Like, how did you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was really more the latter, right? So we ran about a 6-month experiment on that first model that I was describing. So I was finishing up at HBS. I had teamed up with Forrest, my co-founder and CTO. We'd been building it. We built it into a nice business, but I think just from a revenue perspective, but it wasn't satisfying. We really didn't feel like we were solving the core of the problem in the market. And instead we had turned into this lead gen platform, right? We were just connecting 2 sides of the market, but we had no role to play in the delivery of the service. And so it really just didn't feel ultimately like it was the idea that we wanted to sink our teeth into. But we started we knew there were little glimmers of hope there that got us excited about the market. And so what we realized was that as opposed to, in order to actually dive deep and have a real impact in legal, you can't think about legal as a $250 billion market. You have to think about it as a series of these massive sub-verticals. Immigration, $30 billion. Family law, $30 billion, right? Corporate. And so and each of those markets is so fundamentally different. And so that's what we started to do. We started to think about, okay, we can't boil the ocean. We need to go deep into a specific vertical and actually be involved in the delivery of the service. And so as we started to think about different models, we noted the demand for immigration. We noted how immigration is one of the few practice areas that could be structured into a technology-enabled process, unlike a messy divorce or a hairy litigation, right? Immigration fundamentally had some structure to it because of the government. And obviously we saw the growth in the market overall. And so we really took that and said, let's start building solutions specifically for immigration. And we started with consumer-facing solutions, which was in my view, one of the early mistakes in the model, which I can get into.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's making me think about so much of what I've done and so much of what I've sort of seen on the market. How did you? So, because I remember, I mean, I've been following your company for a while. Back before I think it was Bridge.us, right? Because now you're Bridge.legal. You were already in the immigration space. Man, I wish I knew LexScope. That would have been really cool. But I was too late. so you started off on the consumer side with that. What that means is that you were selling, or you were offering immigration services in a sense to individuals who needed it. Now, were these people who needed sort of family-based immigration, or was it already business-based, but it was sort of B2C business immigration?
So it was family-based immigration services. So we started around the time President Obama. So what was interesting was that pivot to focus on immigration coincided with President Obama announcing the Deferred Action Program, right? So DACA rolled out in the fall of 2012, and we viewed that as an opportunity. We said, look, 2 million people are going to need help getting through this new process. So it's sort of this, wide open space where you had all these forms, all these requirements, and these relatively tech savvy young customer base and that needed to apply. And so we said, this is a great place. So we sprinted, I think it was 9 or 10 days. We sprinted nonstop, working head down to get out V1 as quickly as possible, as soon as DACA was announced and rolled out, so that we could try to be there first. And so we built, that was our V1, was what the media called, we hated the analogy, frankly, but it was easy to understand, the TurboTax for immigration. We built the TurboTax for immigration starting with DACA. So we had 4 different forms and an intake process where you go through, you fill out some forms, we populate you fill out an intake, we populate the forms, we give you some supporting documents that you're supposed to provide. And one of I think the early learnings from that was we'd had a bunch of people go through that process. At the end of that process, a bunch of those folks said, look, had a great experience working through the software. Do you guys happen to know any immigration attorneys that can review the application before I submit it to the government? Right. And this is where things come full circle, right? We go, actually, we do know some immigration attorneys, right? We have a bunch of them that we can talk to. And so we went to them. We said, hey, Bob, or hey, Nancy, we have a bunch of applicants that aren't interested in paying $2,000 or $1,500 for DACA. They can't afford that, but they have gone through our workflow. We have completed forms. We have basically a 95% complete application, but they want someone to bless that application, provide some guidance before that's submitted. Are you willing to take on that client for this sort of limited scope representation? And they were actually happy to do it, right? They said, look, you're delivering me a client, you're delivering me all the administrative parts of the process, and I can actually do the stuff I love to do, which is be a lawyer. I can do the legal work. And by the way, I'm happy to reduce my rates significantly in order to provide that, because you're doing, a lot of my costs have now been pushed out. I mean, I'm not paying for a customer acquisition. I'm not paying for a paralegal. This is great. And that's really when we started to see this intersection between technology and high-touch legal services.
I love that, because one of the pieces of pushback that I get all the time, just theoretically, is that technology is taking away the jobs of immigration lawyers. And, my story is a little bit different, because I no longer practice, but I am an immigration lawyer, and I've created something that solved a problem that I had. I never thought about taking away my job or someone else's job. I just thought about, what did I hate about practicing, about being a lawyer? I hated the part where I was not practicing law. You don't go to law school and spend the same proportion of time learning how to fill out forms and how to collate properly. And that's not what law school is, because that's not what being a lawyer is theoretically. But then when you get out into the real world, that's what working as a lawyer actually is like. And so I love that you actually had that experience with folks, because they recognized, okay, well, I was charging $2,000, but how much legal work was I actually doing? If I could strip everything away that was non-legal work and just do the legal work, I'm so much happier. I could do a higher volume of cases, yes, but I'm consistently doing the work that I love doing, that flexes my legal muscle, that is creative to some extent, right? And the rest of the work, which I would delegate to staff that probably didn't like doing it either, a robot can do it for me now. Software can do it for me. So I love that. I do want to note to anybody who's listening, if you have questions, drop them. We're already starting to get some questions. Drop them in the comments. I do see them. we're going to chat for a little bit more, and then we're going to start taking questions like all throughout. So questions that you have about Bridge, for Romish about just the future of immigration law, immigration tech, start asking away, please. We love your questions. It's part of why we're doing this live. Otherwise, I'd be in, just doing a podcast. But the part of the live thing is that we do want to talk to folks who are listening. So you had this realization. You went through this experience of folks loved your product, they loved the experience, but they did want to have that blessing in the end by a lawyer because, well, it's a legal application in a sense. So then you went to your lawyer. Good thing you did you marketplace, right? Because now you had those relationships. So this is also one of those examples of your past failure and what you pivoted away from was nevertheless a step in the right direction. Because if you launched Bridge as it is now, you wouldn't have that foundation of like really great people in your network that you would come to easily and offer them this service. So I think that's just a really important takeaway for me or for anybody else who's listening. So that it sounds like it kind of started as you were going where the wind was taking you because these folks were asking you, hey, can we get a blessing from a lawyer? How did you turn that into your business model?
Yeah, it's a great question. So so in that consumer model, right, we would get, these customers would pay, then part of that would go to the attorney, part of that would go to us. And we had a relationship with those firms. I think that the challenge with that and why we made our next pivot, you'll start to see a theme here. We couldn't scale that business. So while that experience was really good for those customers, we found consumer immigration to be exceptionally challenging to grow and scale that efficiently, right? So we were paying, let's make up some numbers here that are probably directionally accurate. We might be paying $600 to acquire that customer. They were paying us $500 to get through that. And it was a one and done transaction, right? That maybe we'll see them in 5 or 10 years, but nothing immediate, right? They weren't recurring in any way. So we found that model to be very, very challenging in consumer immigration. We raised some money right towards the tail end of that experiment. We said, we need some money, but we need to try something else. And that's when we moved to business immigration. Around that same time on the consumer model, we had a bunch of businesses that were basically saying, hey, look at us over here. We like what you're doing, but we do this many times a year, maybe many times a month. And this is a massive pain point for us because it's not just one user on the other end. We have multiple stakeholders involved in this process, and it's becoming a mess, right? And so we knew that we weren't ready out the gate to build that, but we had an eye towards building a business immigration offering. And like you said, every previous failure is a foundational step for the next piece. And so we built a lot of the technology, the underlying workflow technology is really, we still have some of that from that era, but we pivoted to focus on businesses. We raised a little bit of capital, about $800,000, and then quickly started to focus on businesses and business immigration as a whole.
So I think this is a really interesting point because immigration tech has kind of been around for a while, but people don't think about it in the same way that we think about, self-driving cars or social media apps or things like that. Those are, and I'll admit this, those are the sort of sexier, tech industries, if you will. They're, in the front page of TechCrunch and all that kind of stuff. And I think a big part of that is fundraising. And I think things are changing a little bit, especially with COVID. But overall, fundraising is often seen as it's seen as not just something that will propel you to the next step. It's seen by some people or many people, I think, as like the purpose, the point of starting a company is just to raise money. Can you talk a little bit about that in the immigration space? I know you mentioned, you guys raised $800,000. I believe it was in 2014. It sounds like you didn't do it because you're like, I want to get on the cover of TechCrunch. It was because there was a business model that needed quick and substantial investment, and you couldn't do it organically to really keep up with the demand, which I personally, I think is probably one of the best ways to fundraise, like truly when you need to. But can you talk a little bit about that experience and, maybe did you ever think about not fundraising and just what's that been like?
Yeah. So I think we always knew that at some point we're going to have to take some capital to really fuel this thing and move faster. But we didn't want to do that prematurely, to your point. And so that's why we went a couple years. And those were a tough couple of years, right? I think, I think everyone needs to take a hard look, and there's no perfect advice for fundraising. I think you have to really think about your business model, competitive dynamics, and then maybe most importantly, think about your personal financial situation, right? I started a company the same year my first kid was born. I wouldn't recommend that, but that's how the chips fell, right? And so I was fortunate that my wife had a great job, and in many ways could steer the ship while I started the company. We didn't have to take capital. I had a bit of a nest egg from my finance days, but Forrest and I were very intentional about saying, look, not until we know what we're doing do we want to take some capital. And we started to feel like we had some momentum, but we knew we needed to buy some time. We knew we had to build a team, and we couldn't have done that without taking capital. So, fundraising was challenging. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I think we're all surrounded by, like you said, the TechCrunch headlines of companies raising in a day and a half, and people throwing around term sheets at them. That's not how most companies raise money. It's a slog. We reached out to hundreds of investors. I was sending cold emails. I was reaching out on AngelList. I was doing everything I could. And we were very fortunate to get some amazing investors on board, but it took a while. I made a ton of mistakes that I could probably do a whole nother podcast on. But we went to the big name investors that were about, but realized that those were the wrong folks for the stage that we were at, and eventually found the kinds of investors that really understood the problem we were going after. And I think that's what's so important about immigration is, like you said, it's not sexy, right? And the only folks that are going to understand are either folks that have been through the process themselves, right? Or have experienced the problem, in our case, by running a company that faced this problem, right? So it was either, for us, ultimately, I think you can look at most of our investors and either say they had an immigrant background or had been through the process or knew people around them that knew how challenging this was, or they were business leaders that had hired a bunch of technical talent, a bunch of foreign nationals in the past, and saw how painful that was. And it was one of those two factors that led them to invest.
Hey, Romish, sorry. I think you actually broke up a little bit internet-wise for the last thing that you said. Let me see if okay, I can see you now. Do you want to? Sorry. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Would you mind kind of getting back?
Yeah.
Okay. So what the last thing you said was you found the types of investors that really were understood what you were going after. You don't have to repeat word for word. We actually.
I apologize for that. Can you hear me okay?
It's breaking up a little bit. This is improvised theater, everybody. This is what happens when we do live. Yeah, this happened to me in one of my shows too.
How's that? Any better?
Yeah, I can see you okay and hear you okay.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, take your time. If you got to change internet connections. Yeah, there you go. That looks good.
How's that? Okay. Let me know if it's still choppy.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Where I was going was it really took some time for us to find the investors that understood our space, right? Either they had to have a personal connection to immigration, they understood that problem, or they were business leaders that had hired foreign talent in the past and saw how challenging that was. So it was really one of those two factors that ultimately led people to invest.
We have a question on this topic from Ian Hawes, who is a prior guest on this show. So Ian asked, what was the biggest challenge raising funding for an immigration legal startup? I mean, I think you kind of hit on the fact a little bit, but maybe what was one of the things that really kind of stuck out in your mind as one of the biggest challenges?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges was the chicken and egg problem with investors who wanted to see traction in order to invest. And the reality is we were a team of two that didn't have a ton of traction at least in terms of the metrics that you can look at, revenue, users, at least not exciting enough where that would jump off the page and lead someone to invest. Mm-hmm. And so we were often strung along by these investors that said, look, I want to see your metrics next month or the month after that, and that might lead me to invest. And so we were simultaneously trying to run this business and fundraise at the same time. And so I'd say, to answer your question more directly, and I think the challenge is there's no such thing as, there's not easy MVPs in the immigration or legal space. Legal it's so important to get it right that you can't just half-ass an MVP and slap something together in a weekend and hope that you're going to get a bunch of users, right? The bar is very, very high for that minimum viable product. And so it requires a deep investment in that product in order to get something in the market. So I think that's uniquely challenging about legal or immigration, is that you need a pretty damn good solution before you can actually get it to market.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would agree with that. It's one of those things where, especially in the B2B space, it's never going to go viral and just acquire 1 million users, where a lot of companies are like, just get them on board and then we'll figure out how to monetize later. With B2B, it's a slower burn in terms of getting new clients and, figuring out what their lifetime value is and all that kind of stuff. It takes time, but then to your point, you need money to run the business for long enough to get those metrics. So then it's like, where do you go first? And I think, I guess to your point, that's where you have to find the investors or the people who really understand the vision, and they'll back you with perhaps less objective traction with the current company, but maybe they view other things about you, whether it's your background or, prior things that you've started or things like that, to say, I believe in what you're doing, and I believe that you are the right person and the right team to do it. Awesome. So you raised this money, and you've obviously been growing ever since. You guys haven't raised money since then, and I think that's something that a lot of people probably in the tech space, forget about immigration, but in general, kind of envy, because I'm assuming, just because I've listened to so many people that have fundraised, and then there's every subsequent round has dilution, and there are more people that get on board, and all of a sudden, all these players are steering the ship that were never there before, weren't there in the beginning, and might have a totally different idea of where they want it to end up. If you could just enlighten me, I suppose, and everybody just a little bit, we don't have to go too deep into this, but do you have any thoughts on that? And kind of like, what's it been on your end, saying, okay, we raised this money, we got to where we are, and now we're a business, we're growing for real, not just taking on more and more funding?
Yeah, it's a topic I love, and thank you for that question. I think, to your point, we took the money and we got profitable very quickly. And so we're very intentional about saying, look, we're gonna grow this business the way we want to grow it, and we want to grow it based on customer revenue and not based on some artificial boost that comes from taking venture money. There are trade-offs to these, so I don't think there's a cut and dry, like, don't take money, take money. I think what's interesting in immigration tech, in legal tech, some of these spaces, I don't think immigration is a race. I think it's hard to do. There's a whole graveyard of immigration startups, right? A lot of folks have tried it. It's a hard thing to get right. And therefore, I don't think it's as simple as like, take the money, you'll be able to build the product and you'll be able to get the customers. So it is, you have to sort of brace yourself for the marathon, right? And I'm sure you could speak to this, Roman, with Laborless, right? Like you said, it's not, you don't snap your fingers and have millions of dollars in revenue. So, I think from that perspective, I think you have to take a hard look at your business and say, is this a business that should be backed by venture capital, right? Even if you could get the money, and I think very firmly believe that we could have raised money without a problem, but is this a business that should be venture backed, and what does that mean for how we grow and what we build and who we focus on? So, I think ultimately there are industries and there are products and there are businesses that should be venture funded. My view is that the vast majority should not be. And I think there are far too many businesses that die because they take venture money that could have been great businesses, right? And so I've been very happy that we made that decision. Certainly there are days you wake up and, maybe March or April of this year when COVID hit, would I have loved to have, a massive bank account to fall back on? Look, absolutely. But I think for most days I wake up very happy with that decision. I think it's led us to build a much more responsible and customer-focused business.
Yeah, from everything that I've heard across so many industries, I've certainly heard of people who have taken on a lot of venture funding, enjoyed that for a time, and then realized the expectations were unreasonable, and their business died, and therefore their idea sort of died. And then, but it was like unfortunate, it was something that could have really been a cool thing. You brought up something that obviously I was gonna is my next question, and that is COVID. Right, we're all living in it right now. It has been, aside from the personal sort of an economic crisis that COVID has presented for so many, from the business side, it's been a really fascinating experience, right? I mean, on the one hand, a lot of businesses have shuttered. I mean, the airlines have been hit really hard. Your mom and pop shops, your restaurants, et cetera. Amazon has done tremendously. Spotify has done tremendously. Shopify has done. Peloton has gotten up. Zoom, now it's no longer WebEx, right? That's no longer the verb. It's now Zoom. Or Skype used to be the verb, right? As well. It's now Zoom. So it's interesting to see how all of this has, shifted the way in which we communicate and we do business. What have you seen, with whatever you can share, what have you seen, what impacts have you seen with Bridge, and kind of what do you see more broadly for the industry, I think, given where we're at now and perhaps where immigration and just remote work, et cetera, might go moving forward?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think headwinds and tailwinds for sure. What an interesting year, not just from a broader macroeconomic perspective, but any of us in and around immigration, we've sort of seen the double whammy of, the macro headwinds associated with COVID, and then the policy headwinds with the current administration and administrations all around the world. So we've seen a couple things, right? I think within our existing client base, there's been some companies that have been hit hard, right? Obviously, those with exposure to industries like hospitality or transportation. And we have exposure across the board. We have clients across every sector, across just about every geography. So we've seen kind of an interesting cross-section. That being said, we do have pretty heavy exposure to tech or tech-enabled businesses. This is where the venture funding, right, to get back to the last piece, has actually helped stabilize a lot of those businesses, right? We've seen our venture-backed startups actually fare pretty well and continue to grow and have some of those tailwinds behind them around, broader trends in remote work and collaboration and cloud-based software more generally. So those companies have tended to hold up. Healthcare companies have tended to hold up. But there are certain sectors that have been disproportionately hit. I think on top of that, so obviously any of these businesses that have been hit by layoffs, some portion of those folks that have been laid off have been foreign nationals. That being said, I think immigration is interesting in that, right, if you look at the jobs that have been lost due to layoffs, a pretty small percentage of them are technical roles. Right. So if you look at the jobs, the layoffs in tech, I think only about like 12% affected engineering, product design, these technical roles. And so immigration has fared decently well in that most of the folks that are being sponsored are for technical roles. Right. So from that perspective, even if sales and marketing are being hit hard or general and administrative functions, we haven't seen the same level of impact on our business as maybe the broader macro trends would suggest. But I would say on the other side, the tailwinds, while there has been some impact from a macro perspective on our clients, new business is really starting to pick up as companies are seeking solutions that enable them to work remotely, that provide a better employee experience for their international employees, right? All these trends actually have a direct relationship to what we're seeing in immigration, where companies are really starting to rethink their immigration program. They're rethinking who their immigration provider is. They're really thinking about technology as not a nice to have, but a must have in their immigration function. And so that's been really useful, where the sales pipeline really slowed down quite a bit in March and April. We've really started to see that pick up in May, June, and July, and we're signing on some of our biggest customers ever to date.
That's awesome. Yeah, really, really fascinating to hear that. With Laborless, we sort of had the opposite experience. I think when COVID first hit, a lot of, obviously it was also H-1B cap season. So for any of the folks listening who are on the immigration side, if you remember that part of your year, maybe you're trying to block it out. But this year's H-1B process was also novel in the sense that there was this whole pre-registration process, et cetera. But for us, there were a lot of companies that as soon as COVID hit, they were like, well, we're still going forward with H-1B hiring, but we're not in the office anymore. So where we were going to, handle LCA postings in person, we sort of need a digital solution. But interestingly for us now, it's tapered off. So we grew quite a bit early on, March, April, and then it sort of leveled out, which is really fascinating to see. Because I think right now, maybe people, like in terms of continuing new hiring, it depends on sort of the business. Some of our clients are continuing to like every day. I mean, there are tons of people, but others are sort of slowing down, it feels like. What do you think? We have a question here that sort of is a little bit on topic from Josh. Have you hit any hurdles in terms of regulatory difficulties working in the immigration tech space? And if so, I would love to hear about how you navigated it. The reason I thought it was kind of interesting now is because, to your point, the administration has been sort of hammering on immigration in various ways. And to me, that is a regulatory difficulty because sort of, the technology has to comply with or otherwise keep up with what's happening on the government side. So I don't know, how have you dealt with anything in the past? And maybe perhaps if you can talk a little bit about how you're dealing with things now, or if there's been any impact at all.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Josh. So I would break regulatory into two parts. One is what you described, Roman, which is, obviously, the administration and the constant changes from an immigration perspective it's been arduous to keep up with that, right? We have a team of folks that's constantly trying to make sure we're keeping up with changes, whether that's premium processing being turned on and off, changes in, signatures and e-signatures versus not, new forms, public charge, yes or no, right? There's so many different changes. But I think the other relevant piece, and I'm not sure that I'd qualify this as regulatory per se, but thinking about what it means to be a company trying to disrupt an industry that is traditionally highly regulated, a legal industry that is generally very regulated. And so we've spent a massive amount of time and energy on legal ethics, which is something that I think every legal tech entrepreneur, immigration tech entrepreneur needs to think a lot about. And frankly, I hadn't realized how much time we'd spend. If you asked me years ago, if we'd spend that much time, you could probably have talked me out of this. But so we have one of the leading ethics attorneys in the country. That's basically, we work with her constantly to refine our model to make sure we're firmly in front of and stay out of any kind of legal ethics gray areas. Because we work with attorneys, right? Because attorneys are our partners. It's really important for us to, right? We as a company that's not a law firm, we're not particularly challenged from that perspective, but we want to make sure that our partner firms are not running into any challenges as well. And so we spend a ton of time and energy investing in legal ethics, making sure that we're setting up the right models, whether that's from a payment perspective or from an agreement perspective, contractually, thinking through all the ins and outs of that. So I would say that's maybe, Josh, maybe like I wouldn't necessarily call it a hurdle. It's just something to consider. I think if you can get that right, it's actually a competitive advantage, right? That if you can be on the right side of that from a legal ethics perspective and stay out of any gray area, you can really innovate within bounds and get attorneys on your side, which I think is really important, and get companies very comfortable with your model. So yeah, we spent a ton of time there, and I think it's a really important investment.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, so thank you all. There's a question here, I think that is, on the broad side of things from Abheet Chawla. Obviously, there are a bunch of players in the space. One of the sort of more traditional immigration tech companies, INSZoom. So Abheet Chawla asks, how do you compare your product with INSZoom? And I think, if I can maybe paraphrase it a little bit, I think it's like, what are the differences in business models, right? Because comparison is subjective in a sense. So I think we can talk about, so like, what are the differences? So for folks who maybe are just getting into immigration law and are getting an understanding of the technology landscape, or folks who are on the outskirts of immigration altogether, what are the different sort of business models, and sort of how would yours compare to a company like INSZoom?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to break down immigration tech, as we use that term, into some subcategories, because I think we maybe overly simplify that as an industry. I think we have maybe three different buckets, right? We have immigration lawyer tech, for lack of a better term, right? So actually the legal tech, we're enabling attorneys as our primary user. That's one group, which is where I think I'd put INSZoom and LawLogix and Tracker and some of these other systems. You then have what I think is really HR tech, right? Which is, I think, where I would put Bridge. Our primary focus is on building immigration solutions for companies, right? And that's our primary. That when we go into product meetings, that's who we're thinking about, is both the company and then, of course, the international employees that are associated with that company. The lawyers in our model, extremely valuable. The technology serves those attorneys, but I don't think of ourselves as a case management solution. That's not how we've designed it, and that's not who our primary end user is. And so I think that's the second bucket. I'd call it HR tech, or there's probably a better term for it, but technology that's really meant to serve the company that's going through the immigration process. And then the third bucket I'd say is immigrant tech, right? So again, terrible name for it, but think about the solutions that are primarily built to serve the individual immigrant. So I'd think about companies like Boundless, for example. I would think about even companies that aren't directly related to immigration, but whose customer base is predominantly immigrants. So Nova Credit is a great example, or Stilt, or any of these companies that are helping immigrants get better financial products or help them along that journey as an immigrant. So that's one way, Abheet, that I would start to think about that, is those three buckets. We don't consider ourselves, we don't consider INSZoom or LawLogix really in our direct space, because today we don't sell software directly to attorneys. We go to companies, and we believe we've created a solution that helps solve some of the major problems that companies have with the traditional immigration services model. Those three problems, really briefly. First problem we see with the traditional immigration services model is that it's very inefficient and disorganized because of the lack of technology. The second is that the employee experience for foreign nationals, we believe to be very poor in the traditional model, that there's a lot to be desired there. And then we think the third part is that immigration has historically been a very reactive and transactional process, as opposed to a strategic and proactive function for companies. And so we aim to use technology alongside high-touch legal services to solve those specific problems for companies.
If we can, because I think one of the things you always talk about is this forward-looking strategic piece. Can we dive into that for just a minute or two?
Yeah.
How do you think that should look? And I suppose, what have you done with Bridge to kind of make that vision come to life?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into why immigration's been as transactional as it has been, right? You could talk about this is how lawyers get paid. You could talk about this is how companies have historically thought of this function as like an administrative, let's just get through the visa process. That's all there is to it. Getting that approval is really the end goal. I think over the past 5 or so years, driven by a bunch of different market forces, one, as challenging as immigration is, two, companies thinking more holistically about the employee experience, series of other reasons, but effectively, the immigration function is no longer just processing cases, right? And so when we talk about these other parts of the journey, we're talking about thinking about all the other things that happen around the case. For example, the entire journey of being a foreign national at a company, from the pre-hire stage through international travel that happens around the cases, around every application, all the way through to termination of the employee and doing that compliantly and following the right procedures there. And then we also think about this layer that we call strategic program management. And this is the idea that you should be building an immigration program as opposed to thinking about every individual case as an ad hoc standalone transaction. So that's everything from creating an immigration policy, right? If you can actually document the rules of your program, there's a ton of benefits that come with that. This then allows you to budget and forecast and actually build a long-term immigration plan for every single employee. These are things like standardizing your immigration job descriptions, so you're not reinventing the wheel every time, right? This is stakeholder training to ensure that not just your HR team is versed in immigration, but your recruiters, your hiring managers, everyone up and down the organization. So when we talk about these non-transactional elements, this is sort of what we mean. And so we built a bunch of not just technology, but services to enable companies to really think more holistically and proactively about their immigration function.
There's a really great follow-up question to this from Ken. And basically he asked, what are some of the key objections you get from prospects around the business model? I mean, I think this goes towards one of the earlier questions about breaking up immigration tech into various different buckets, and those buckets inherently have different business and operational models. What are some of the objections that you get? Because to your point, different solutions are right for different people.
Yeah.
So what have you seen in that space?
So I think two main challenges, right? One is we really need to work to educate the customer or the prospective customer about what immigration could be, right? What is a gold standard immigration function, and how does that compare to where you are today? Because of this mentality that immigration, I think there's these long-held beliefs that many people have that, look, immigration is getting cases approved. And if my cases are getting approved, there's nothing to improve, right? Why would I switch providers? Why would I evaluate anything? I have 100% approval rate. Right? And in our view, that's a very narrow view of success. Getting case approvals is obviously super, super important. We don't discount that at all. But it's just one element of what a successful immigration program should look like, right? Imagine, Roman, you have customers that have 100% approval rate, but the difference, or a high approval rate, I should say, but the difference between using something like Laborless and not is a dramatic change in that customer experience, in your compliance. I mean, there's all these other benefits. Yeah. So one I think, is rewiring the prospect to help them understand what immigration could look like, right? And if you're unable to do that, that's a hurdle in the sales process. The second one I'd say for us is today in our sales process, we ask a company to not only switch to our technology platform, but we also ask them to switch to one of our partner attorneys, right? And those relationships can often be very sticky that they have with their current legal service provider. So they might say, look, I've been working with Ken for 15 years. He's amazing. I would never do anything to, as great as your technology seems, I would love to have the technology, but I really want to use it with Ken, right? And so that's another hurdle we hit in our sales process, is folks saying, love the tech. I'm sure your experience is great, but I have this long-standing relationship with my immigration provider that I'm not willing to experiment with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something that at some point it's like, well, unless you guys fundamentally change your business model, that's okay. It's just that's part of business. No one's going to have 100% of the market. I don't know if you watched any of the congressional hearings with the big four tech companies, but Mark Zuckerberg made this really big speech about how there's so many companies bigger than Facebook. TikTok's growing faster, and YouTube has more video, and so I think the idea is that different business models exist for the very reason that we need different business models for folks to work different ways.
Yep.
And thank you, Ken. So we have another great question here from Ron. How do you go to table with big companies? Are you actively marketing with certain stakeholders that don't historically interface with law firms, or sort of, to me, this is a little bit of a marketing and sales question, but I think it's really interesting to some of the other immigration tech or probably other immigration lawyers that are trying to grow.
Yeah, I mean, we have a fantastic sales and marketing team that really drives this process, where we're every day reaching out to companies, and these are various stakeholders. This might be reaching out to the primary day-to-day point of contact with a particular message about how we can help them as the day-to-day immigration point of contact. But that's a different message than if we went to their manager, right? We're talking about different things. We're maybe not talking about how much time we can save you on the administrative side of the process, but we're talking more strategically to the VP of HR about talent acquisition and how we can help them with talent acquisition, mitigating risk, improving compliance. So our message is very different depending on who within the organization we're talking to. In terms of just sort of that motion and how we're doing that, right? That's a combination of we have SDRs, so sales development representatives that are really driving that initial point of contact, reaching out either by phone or email or social media, and really starting discussions. I think ultimately, for us, it comes down to approaching those as a consultative sales process. So there's very little we're trying to do other than start a conversation with you about your immigration program. We're not pushing bridge. We're not pushing our tech. We're just trying to understand and have a conversation. Hey, let's talk about your immigration program. Let's talk about what problems or challenges you might be having. And let's figure out whether or not bridge is a potential solution. So we try to take a very consultative approach. It is challenging, right? There's obviously challenges with getting in the door anywhere. I think that's some of the challenge of being a smaller firm, is that there's perception tied to that, right? You might, when I go to your website, if I see that you're a 4-person firm, there might be perception that I have as a big company. And so we have found it easier as we've grown, right? When it was me and a PowerPoint presentation, right, in 2015, we couldn't get to the table with big companies. We were focused on small and mid-sized businesses. But as we've grown, as our team has grown, as our logos have grown, and as our customers can vouch and be our best sales team, right? We often have our customers on reference calls with these big companies going to bat for us. And that's more than anything that we could ever say in a sales discussion. Ultimately, if you can have your clients advocate on your behalf, do case studies. I think lawyers underuse case studies, frankly. I think case studies or other ways, right? Strip down that bio that just talks about where you went to law school and, like kind of the generic stuff, and really get into the stories. I think storytelling is very, very powerful. So, there's no silver bullet, Ron, I'd say. We just are active in a lot of different channels and really just trying to have human conversations with those buyers.
And one thing I would echo with that is sometimes you get on a call with somebody for like you said, a consultative sales call. And not only is it interesting for them to learn about what you do, but you might learn something about what you're missing or what they potentially need that either you don't have, or perhaps it's on your product roadmap, but you really feel like you should now bump it up because you've heard now from 6 people saying that it's really important for them. So yeah, I agree with you. From a sales perspective, for me, I've always thought about it as like, you should never push anything down anyone's throat. Like having that conversation is the easiest way to get in the door with someone. get it in the door somewhere and talk with someone. And the other thing is like genuinely be open to understanding that you might not be the right answer. I think some people are so fixated on getting every single sale that they shoot themselves in the foot by ruining that relationship at that time. Sometimes you're never going to be the right service. Sometimes you're not the right service right now, but you might be 6 months down the road, right? And if you get on the phone with them and you understand their problem, and you're like, look, I'll be honest with you. If I were you, I wouldn't work with us right now. Come back to us if XYZ pillars are put up on your side, or alternatively, we'll reach out to you when we have the things that you say are really important. And maybe we'll talk then. And I think people really appreciate that.
I love that. Yeah, our team calls that our living, breathing sales pipeline, right? This idea that it's not, if someone doesn't say yes today, some of our biggest deals have come from a conversation maybe a year ago. That, it was a cordial, it was a great conversation. They weren't ready then. And ultimately something breaks, right? Just, you hang around long enough and something in their model, something that they're doing today, they finally see the value, they finally hit a problem, and they remember that conversation with Bridge.
Yep.
And they go, let me go back to those guys. I didn't understand it fully then, or it wasn't a priority then. There's so many elements outside of your control. But by building that brand and just being seen as someone that cares genuinely, whether or not that you get that sale, I think that's been a huge realization for us, is that a no just means no now, doesn't mean no forever.
Exactly. Well, so I want to be conscious of your time, and I want to be conscious of everyone else watching. We have a really great question that I thought we can sort of end the questions on, and then maybe I'll have one or two more things for you. Then we'll let you go back to your Friday afternoon. So this one comes from Marco, and Marco says, "What would you do differently if you were launching your company today?"
This is such a good question. Thank you, Marco. I've made so many mistakes on this journey, so there's so many things I would do differently, and I hope to eventually have an opportunity to start one or many more companies down the road. I think there's a couple things. One, personally, and I don't think this is for everyone, I would think about whether you're a B2B entrepreneur or a B2C entrepreneur. So whether you're really built to be someone that solves problems that companies have, or solves problems that consumers have. If I sort of take an introspective look at myself, I'm much more a B2B leader than I am a B2C leader. I like being able to talk to customers and deeply understand their problems, and then create a product that solves those problems and be able to capture some of that value, right? Create value, capture value. It's much more rational. Whereas consumer, obviously massive consumer businesses out there, but consumer is a little more fickle, right? It's harder to sort of get into this motion of like, what are your problems? Let me solve those problems and let me make money off of that. So for me, it was huge to realize that, look, I'm really built to be a B2B guy. And I think I'll never start a consumer, and never say never, but I don't think I'll ever start a consumer facing company. So think about, who you are. I would say that was one of my big mistakes, as we started as a consumer company. And I don't think we were ever, myself or Forrest, really ever geared to be a consumer facing entrepreneur. And then the other piece is, I think thinking a lot about, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and say, focus on distribution as much as you think about product. Spend that same amount of time thinking about distribution. So distribution meaning, how am I actually going to get this product into my customers' hands? I think there's far too many companies or entrepreneurs that think about building that perfect product. And the reality is, a perfect product still doesn't sell itself. There's no product that sells itself. And you really need to figure out how you can actually get that product into the hands of your customers. So spend as much time, if not more time, thinking about distribution, sales, and marketing as you do thinking about the product. Otherwise, you're going to build a great product that no one's using.
Couldn't agree more with that. With that last piece, I'm a big fan of marketing. I also enjoy it quite a bit, and I think through the marketing process, you not only get to build your own story, but you get to build out the story of our entire industry. Because I think as we, as you've pushed and other folks have pushed the narrative and the idea that immigration should be more tech enabled, it should be more customer focused. I think just the doors are opening for more and more opportunities. And so, yes, that's marketing, but on the other hand, it's also a collective progress, I think, of our industry. So it's sort of a rising tide lifts all boats, which I think Ken is who inspired that quote to like stick in my head for some reason. So awesome. That was a really, really awesome question. I want to start ending these conversations with like one last sort of fun question perhaps. So I think my question to you would be, if you had a web series made about your journey in the immigration tech space, what would that web series be called? And who would be the star? You can't be the star. Even if you want to be on TV, you can't be the star.
Who would be the star? As in someone within the company, or it could be anyone?
No, anybody. Yeah.
Honestly, we've made so many mistakes on this journey. I might call it like a comedy of errors.
Uh-huh.
And maybe it's starring Sacha Baron Cohen. I think you have to kind of be lighthearted about it, thinking about the journey, right? Bridge has not been an overnight success. We have a lot more work to do. And I think, honestly, in many ways, you look back on the journey and it becomes it's so obvious, the pivots we've made in retrospect. But as we were going through them, we thought that we had it figured out at every one of those pivots. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it has been, I joke about that and I try to be lighthearted about those mistakes that we've made. I think they've ultimately been really empowering and they've helped us build the company that we have today. But yeah, it's been a hell of a ride. And, I hope my goal is to ensure that people will make their own mistakes on their journey. I just hope they don't make some of the same mistakes we do. I really want this space to thrive. I think we're in the early innings of legal immigration tech, whatever you want to call it, the very early innings. And I think the best is yet to come. So I'd love to help people avoid some of the missteps we made and help accelerate progress in this space.
100%. That's why I'm doing this. I wish I had you buzzing in my ear in 2014, 2013, back when this was still kind of a nascent idea. But thank you, and very nice. I like the I like the choice there. Well, Romish, thank you so much. This has been awesome. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. I've learned so much about you today and just a lot of your insights into the industry, a lot of stuff that I've learned for myself and things for me to think about, for whatever I'm working on with Laborless or otherwise. So thank you. Thank you so much for spending your time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Roman.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate everyone listening. And I hope you have learned something. I hope you've really took something away. If it's gotten you to think about immigration in a different way, awesome. While we're leaving this right now, drop more comments. If you're watching this later on, drop comments. I will respond. Maybe Romish will respond, get some conversations going. I think the biggest and most important thing that we can take away from this is that we need to continue the discussion around what immigration should look like, how tech can enable a different or better future for our industry. And I think we're all part of that discussion. So thank you. And I hope you tune in next week, 4 p.m. on Friday, for the next episode of the GMI Rocket Show. All right, everybody. Peace out.